Nobody expected this night to matter. Not the producers. Not the executives. Not the league. And definitely not the people who approved the segment. On paper, it was harmless. A crossover moment. A feel-good appearance. The kind of thing networks do all the time. Bring in the hot name, let her smile, ask a few safe questions, roll a couple highlights, and move on like nothing happened. That was the plan. But plans only work when the person you invite agrees to play the role you've written for them. And that's where this went wrong. Because Caitlin Clark didn't walk onto that set like someone borrowing the spotlight. She walked on like someone who already owned it. And once that happened, there was no rewinding the night, no spinning the narrative, no pretending this was just another segment. By the end of the broadcast, something had shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically. Quiet shifts are always the most dangerous. Phones buzzed in pockets. Texts flew between people who weren't supposed to be watching that closely. Executives leaned back in their chairs, not smiling, not celebrating, just staring. Because they all felt the same thing at the same time. This wasn't supposed to happen yet. Not this fast. Not this confidently. Not on this stage. And definitely not without permission. What aired on NBC wasn't just television. It was exposure. Not of Caitlin Clark. Everyone already knew she was special, but of a system that suddenly realized it might not be in control anymore. And the scariest part? It only took one night. But before the panic, before the silence, before the whispers started behind closed doors, there was a single moment when the room changed, and almost no one noticed it happening in real time. At first, everything felt normal. The broadcast rolled on like any other NBA night. Highlights cycling through. Analysts joking. Crowd noise humming in the background. The kind of controlled chaos sports television has perfected over decades. Nothing out of place. Nothing tense. Nothing unusual. Then her name was said. Not shouted. Not hyped. Just dropped into the conversation like it was routine. Joining us tonight, Caitlin Clark. That should have been the end of it. A quick camera cut, a polite smile, maybe a little applause, and the show keeps moving. Instead, the atmosphere changed. Not excitement. Not hype. Something heavier. It's hard to explain unless you've been in rooms like that. When something unexpected happens, not visibly wrong, but off. Like the air tightens just a bit. Like people suddenly sit up straighter without realizing why. The camera cut to her, and instantly it was clear. She wasn't nervous. No stiff posture. No wide-eyed amazement. No, I can't believe I'm here energy. She looked settled. Comfortable. Like someone who had done this 100 times already. Sitting between veteran analysts, former NBA players, people who built careers owning the room. And she didn't shrink. She didn't lean back. She didn't oversmile. She belonged. And that's the part that throws people off. Viewers expect rookies to look grateful. Networks expect young stars to act impressed. Leagues expect newcomers to move carefully, to understand the hierarchy, to stay in their lane. Caitlin Clark didn't acknowledge a lane. She didn't talk like someone visiting the biggest basketball stage in America. She talked like someone already familiar with it. Like someone who didn't need approval to be there. At first, it came out casually. A joke here. A quick comment there. Poking fun, relaxed, sharp. The kind of confidence that doesn't beg for attention, it assumes it. And then the basketball talk started. That's when the real tension crept in. She didn't speak in cliches. She didn't default to safe answers. She broke down plays, explained spacing, talked pick-and-roll coverages, corrected small details, not aggressively, not disrespectfully, just matter of fact, like this was her world too. Former NBA players nodded. Hosts paused. The rhythm of the show subtly shifted around her. That's when viewers at home started feeling it. Not wow, she's good. But why does she sound like this? Because rookies aren't supposed to sound like authorities. Guests aren't supposed to guide conversations. And women's basketball stars, especially young ones, aren't supposed to step onto NBA platforms and command them. It breaks an unwritten rule. And unwritten rules are the ones leagues protect the hardest. The more she spoke, the clearer it became. This wasn't a media-trained appearance. This wasn't someone reading the room carefully, trying not to overstep. She wasn't trying to fit in. She already had. And once people realized that, the night stopped being cute. Social media noticed first. It always does. Clips started circulating. Not highlights, moments. Her tone. Her confidence. The way the room deferred without meaning to. Comments shifted fast. Less praise, more curiosity. She's actually running the segment. Why does she sound more prepared than the hosts? How is she this comfortable already? That question, how, is the one that makes executives nervous. Because when viewers start asking how instead of why, they stop accepting surface answers. And that's when the appearance quietly crossed a line. Because Caitlin Clark didn't look like a rising star being introduced to the audience. She looked like the future showing up early. And somewhere behind the scenes, people began realizing something uncomfortable. If she could do this without trying, what happens next? At some point during the broadcast, a subtle line disappeared. No one announced it. No graphic flashed on the screen. But the tone shifted from featuring Caitlin Clark to something much more dangerous. The show stopped orbiting around her. It started responding to her. That's the moment networks don't plan for. At first, the hosts were doing what they always do with special guests, asking broad questions, setting her up for clean sound bites, keeping the conversation moving at a safe pace. Standard television rhythm. Controlled. Predictable. Then Caitlin answered. Not with polished media phrases. Not with the careful wording rookies are trained to use. She went straight into detail. Not long-winded, not showy, precise. Talking coverages. Talking spacing. Explaining why certain actions fail and why others work. And she didn't stop there. When a host framed something slightly off, she corrected it. Casually. Calmly. Like someone adjusting a detail in a conversation she was already comfortable leading. No hesitation. No second-guessing. That's when people on set started doing something instinctively. They paused. You can always tell who has authority in a room by who others wait on before speaking. And suddenly, seasoned analysts were waiting on her. Former NBA players, guys who've been on national television for years, were nodding along while she explained concepts they've lived with their entire careers. Not because she demanded it, because she earned it instantly. This is where the appearance crossed from impressive to unsettling. Because leagues are built on hierarchy. Networks are built on roles. Guests stay guests. Hosts guide conversations. Veterans lead. Rookies follow. Caitlin Clark inverted that without raising her voice once. She didn't dominate the room by force. She did it by competence, by clarity, by speaking like someone who didn't need to prove she belonged. And the scariest kind of authority is the kind that feels natural. Viewers at home picked up on it fast. You could see it in how the conversation online evolved in real time. At first, people were surprised, then curious, then something shifted again. Respect turned into attention. Attention turned into fixation. People weren't just watching the game anymore. They were watching her reactions, waiting for her next take, listening to how she broke things down. That's when it stopped being a segment. It became a problem, because attention is currency, and Caitlin Clark was pulling it without asking. Not from women's basketball fans, from NBA fans, from casual viewers, from people who didn't tune in expecting to care. When that happens, leagues lose their favorite talking point, control. This wasn't a planned rollout. This wasn't a coordinated media strategy. This was organic dominance, and organic dominance is impossible to contain once it starts spreading. You could feel the realization settling in on set. The energy wasn't celebratory. It wasn't proud. It was cautious. Like everyone suddenly understood they were witnessing something they hadn't prepared for. Because when a rookie speaks with authority on a platform bigger than her league, it creates a dangerous question behind the scenes. If she sounds like this now, what will she sound like next year? Or the year after that? And more importantly, who does she belong to? That's the part no one wanted to address out loud. Because the moment a player stops feeling like a league asset and starts feeling like an independent voice, the balance shifts. She wasn't representing a brand. She wasn't echoing talking points. She wasn't staying neutral. She was being herself, informed, confident, unfiltered. And that kind of presence doesn't stay contained. By the time the segment ended, viewers weren't asking if she belonged on the broadcast. They were asking why she hadn't been there sooner. And that question is dangerous, because it exposes hesitation, missed opportunities, and fear. But the real wave hadn't even hit yet. Because while the conversation played out on air, something else was happening in parallel, faster, louder, and far harder to control. Social media had already decided this wasn't normal. And once the internet smells authority, it amplifies it. That's when things started moving in ways the league couldn't slow down. And what happened next would make this appearance impossible to downplay. By the time anyone behind the scenes realized something was off, it was already too late. Because while the broadcast was still live, the internet had moved on from watching to reacting. Clips started spreading almost instantly. Not the flashy ones. Not highlights or jokes. The moments that felt different. The pauses. The nods from veteran players. The way the hosts adjusted their tone when she spoke. That's how authority travels online. Quietly at first. Then all at once. At first, the comments were surprised. She actually knows the game. She sounds more comfortable than the analysts. Why does this feel different? Then the questions got sharper. Why hasn't she been on here before? How is she this polished already? Is she bigger than the league already? That last one is the kind of sentence leagues pretend not to see. Because once that idea enters the public conversation, it doesn't go away. It mutates. It spreads. And it forces people to pick sides whether they want to or not. This wasn't women's basketball discourse anymore. This was basketball discourse. NBA fans were weighing in. Casual viewers were tuning back in just to hear her again. People who didn't plan to care suddenly did. And that's the nightmare scenario. Because leagues thrive on funnels. Attention flows in predictable directions. College to pro. Minor to major. Women's to men's. Controlled pipelines that make money and keep order. Caitlin Clark blew straight through the pipeline. She didn't ask NBA fans to come find her. She met them where they already were. On their screens. On their night. On their broadcast. And once attention crosses that line, it stops being something the league can manage. Behind the scenes, phones started buzzing. Not celebration texts. Not congratulations. Questions. Are you watching this? Did we approve this? How did this happen? Front office staff who weren't supposed to be tuned in suddenly were. People who had no reason to care about a guest appearance were refreshing clips, reading comments, watching engagement spike in real time. Because the metrics were unmistakable. Every segment she touched jumped. Every clip with her face traveled faster. Every mention pulled people in who weren't there for the game. And that's when fear enters the room. Because fear isn't about what is. It's about what might be next. If fans are tuning in for her instead of the game, what happens when she's not there? If NBA viewers are asking for more of her, who do they credit? The network? The league? Or her? Those questions don't have comfortable answers. And the worst part, this wasn't planned. Insiders would later describe the same word being repeated internally that night. Unplanned. Nobody scheduled this moment. Nobody modeled it. Nobody ran projections on it. Which means nobody controlled it. And control is everything to a league. For years, there had been an unspoken agreement across basketball media. Women's basketball stayed in its own lane. Men's basketball dominated the main stages. Crossovers happened occasionally, carefully, safely. No one skipped steps. No one broke the order. Caitlin Clark didn't just skip a step. She stepped onto the biggest platform in the sport and made it look normal. That's what rattled people the most. Because once something looks normal, it can't be undone. But the night still had one more moment that pushed this from uncomfortable to undeniable. Because at some point, the broadcast cut away from the studio. And what the cameras showed next changed how everyone interpreted the entire appearance. When the feed shifted to Madison Square Garden, no one expected what they were about to hear. And when the crowd reacted, the debate ended instantly. Because that reaction wasn't media hype. It was raw. It was loud. And it wasn't chanting for the game. It was chanting her name. By the time the cameras cut away from the studio, the mood behind the scenes had already changed. What started as confusion was turning into something sharper. Concern. Because inside league offices and production rooms, people were no longer watching casually. They were watching closely, rewinding clips, monitoring reactions, checking numbers that weren't supposed to spike this fast. This wasn't how controlled exposure works. Controlled exposure is gradual, predictable, approved weeks in advance. It's designed to introduce a player, not elevate them beyond the system that introduced them. What was happening with Caitlin Clark didn't fit any of those models. Phones kept lighting up. Messages were short, direct, nervous. Why is she on prime time? Who greenlit this? This is getting bigger than expected. No one wanted to say the real thought out loud yet, but it hovered in every conversation. She's taking up too much space. And space is currency. For years, the balance had been clear. NBA broadcasts centered NBA stars. Women's basketball existed in a parallel world, growing, respected, but separate. There were lanes, boundaries, Agreements that didn't need to be written because everyone understood them. You don't cross over like this unless you're invited carefully. And even then, you don't dominate. But Caitlin Clark didn't look like someone visiting another world. She looked like someone expanding into it. That's when the internal justification started. Some called it hype. Some called it novelty. Some said it would pass. Those explanations are comforting because they suggest control will return naturally. That if you just wait it out, the system will correct itself. But then the broadcast cut to Madison Square Garden, and everything got louder. MSG isn't just an arena. It's a symbol, a place loaded with history, a stage where legends are measured, not introduced, where the crowd decides who matters. And that crowd didn't hesitate. They weren't reacting politely. They weren't acknowledging a guest. They were chanting her name. Caitlin, 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 on an NBA night. Not during a women's game. Not during a crossover event. During a men's professional basketball broadcast in the most iconic arena in the world. That's when any attempt to downplay the night collapsed. Because you can't manufacture that. You can't script it. And you definitely can't explain it away as marketing. Crowds don't chant because they're told to. They chant because they feel something. And what they felt wasn't curiosity. It was recognition. Inside offices, inside production trucks, inside league spaces that suddenly felt very small, one realization landed hard. This wasn't a segment anymore. It was a signal. A signal that attention had shifted somewhere it wasn't supposed to. That fans were responding to a player in a way that bypassed the traditional ladder completely. And that terrifies systems built on patience. Because patience keeps order. Patience keeps salaries manageable. Patience keeps leverage where it's always been. Caitlin Clark didn't ask for patience. She didn't wait to be crowned. She didn't wait for permission. She didn't wait for the league to catch up. She showed up where the spotlight already was, and the crowd followed her. That's when executives start asking questions they don't like the answers to. If fans follow her, do they still need us? If networks want her, do they need to go through us? If sponsors see her face everywhere, who holds the power? Those questions don't get answered publicly. They get answered in closed rooms, with careful language and tight smiles. And suddenly, the night didn't feel celebratory anymore. It felt dangerous. Because once a player proves she can command attention outside her league's ecosystem, the old rules stop working. And Caitlin Clark didn't just test that idea. She proved it live. But the most uncomfortable part hadn't even surfaced yet. Because while executives worried about control and optics, something else was happening quietly. Something far more personal. The veterans were watching. And what they felt wasn't excitement. It was replacement anxiety. While executives were worried about leverage and control, a different reaction was unfolding somewhere else. Quieter. Heavier. More personal. The veterans were watching. Players who had spent years grinding through empty arenas. Players who flew commercial when nobody was filming. Players who did interviews that barely moved the needle. Players who were told, over and over again, that growth takes time and respect has to be earned slowly. They watched a 22-year-old walk onto a national NBA broadcast and command more attention in one night than they'd received across entire seasons. And that doesn't feel abstract. That feels like replacement. No one says it out loud. They don't need to. Athletes understand the math instinctively. There are only so many opportunities. Only so much airtime. Only so many endorsement dollars. When someone absorbs attention that fast, it doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from the same pool everyone else has been swimming in for years. That's where the discomfort deepened. Because this wasn't Caitlin Clark being good. That part was easy to accept. Great players always exist. Talent alone doesn't create resentment. Speed does. She didn't wait her turn. She didn't climb rung by rung. She didn't slowly build recognition within the system. She bypassed it. And when someone bypasses the system, everyone who followed the rules feels it. Imagine dedicating a decade to growing the game, fighting for better conditions, advocating for exposure, being told the league comes first, that collective growth matters more than individual shine, then watching someone arrive and instantly become the center of the conversation without ever having to say those words. It doesn't feel inspirational. It feels like the rules changed without warning. That's why the whispers started. They're forcing her everywhere. It's just hype. This won't last. Those phrases don't come from hatred. They come from self-preservation. From people trying to make sense of a shift that threatens their place in the story. Because once fans start asking for one player specifically, the collective narrative weakens. And for leagues built on parity and shared identity, that's a dangerous direction. But here's the problem. The numbers didn't care about feelings. Every time Caitlin Clark appeared on screen, engagement spiked. Not gradually, dramatically. Clips didn't just perform well, they outperformed everything around them. That's when resentment and reality collided. Because you can debate narratives. You can question hype. You can argue fairness. But you can't argue with attention. And attention kept choosing her. That's when the story flipped in a way no one wanted to acknowledge publicly. It wasn't that she was benefiting from the league's visibility. The league was benefiting from hers. That realization cuts deep. Because it reverses the power dynamic everyone is used to. It suggests the system isn't creating the star is carrying the system. And once that idea takes hold, it spreads fast. Veterans felt it. Executives feared it. Networks noticed it. Because suddenly, Caitlin Clark wasn't just a player. She was a variable the league couldn't control. And that's when things took another strange turn. Because it wasn't just the fans responding to her. The room itself started changing around her. Hosts leaned in. Guests deferred. The broadcast adjusted. She wasn't just participating anymore. She was shaping the conversation. And when a rookie starts shaping the room on national television, the shift becomes impossible to ignore. That's when the night crossed into something even more uncomfortable. Because it wasn't just about attention anymore. It was about dominance. And dominance, when it appears unexpectedly, creates enemies faster than anything else. There's one thing leagues trust more than narratives. Numbers. You can spin stories. You can soften language. You can redirect attention with press releases and talking points. But numbers don't care about politics, feelings, or history. And the numbers that night were loud. Every segment Caitlin Clark appeared in saw a jump. Not a slow climb. A spike. Engagement didn't drift upward. It snapped into place. Clips featuring her moved faster, traveled farther, and pulled in viewers who weren't watching for anything else. That's when denial stopped working. Because this wasn't one viral moment. It wasn't a lucky break. It was a pattern forming in real time. Networks notice patterns instantly. They track where viewers come from, where they stay, and where they leave. They know exactly which faces keep people watching and which ones don't. And as the data came in, the conclusion became unavoidable. She wasn't riding momentum. She was creating it. That realization changes everything. Because leagues are built on the assumption that the system produces stars, not the other way around. The league provides the platform. The players benefit. That's the agreement, spoken or not. But Caitlin Clark broke that illusion. Because fans weren't saying, the league is doing great. They were saying, I'm watching because of her. That's a dangerous sentence. It shifts leverage instantly. If viewers follow a player instead of a logo, the power moves. If ratings depend on an individual, negotiations change. Sponsorship conversations change. Media relationships change. And suddenly, the league isn't the gatekeeper anymore. That's when anxiety spreads quietly. Because if one player can move the needle this much without the system's help, what happens when she starts choosing where she appears? What happens when networks don't need permission? What happens when sponsors call her directly instead of waiting for league approval? Those questions don't get asked publicly. They get asked in hushed conversations with doors closed. This is where the tone shifts from discomfort to fear. Not fear of her talent, fear of her independence. Because once a player doesn't need the system loses its strongest weapon, control. And control is how leagues maintain balance. It's how they keep narratives aligned. It's how they prevent one figure from becoming bigger than the collective. But Caitlin Clark wasn't just growing fast. She was growing sideways. Across platforms. Across audiences. Across boundaries that weren't meant to be crossed yet. That's when the comparisons started, quietly at first. Who else pulls numbers like this? Who else changes ratings just by speaking? Who else commands this much attention without trying? Those comparisons never end comfortably. Because they force organizations to confront something they avoid at all costs. They missed it. Someone hesitated. Someone delayed. Someone overthought the moment. Another network passed. Another executive waited for the right time. NBC didn't. They moved fast. Booked it. Aired it. And overnight, they owned the moment. Which means someone else didn't. And when you miss a generational shift, people remember. That's why the reaction after the broadcast wasn't celebration. It was silence. No victory laps. No internal congratulations. No public statements praising the moment. Just quiet. The kind of quiet that follows realization. Because everyone understood the same thing at once. This wasn't exposure. It was confirmation. Confirmation that Caitlin Clark wasn't just changing women's basketball. She was changing how basketball media works entirely. And once that realization settles in, the panic doesn't fade. It grows. Because the question is no longer whether she's a star. The question becomes how long the system can keep pretending she isn't bigger than it. And that's when the room started responding to her differently. Not just the audience. The people on camera. There's a moment in every power shift when the change stops being theoretical. You can feel it. That moment came when Caitlin Clark wasn't just answering questions anymore. People started deferring to her. Not out of politeness. Not because she was the guest. But because the room recognized competence and adjusted instinctively. Hosts began framing questions differently. Less guiding. More inviting. They waited to hear what she thought before moving on. Former players nodded along as she spoke, letting her finish instead of jumping in. That doesn't happen by accident. Television rooms are built on rhythm. Everyone knows when to talk, when to interrupt, when to move the conversation forward. It's choreographed chaos. And suddenly, that rhythm centered on her. She wasn't raising her voice. She wasn't forcing her way in. She was just right. Clear. Decisive. Comfortable in a space most rookies treat like sacred ground. That's when the word no one wanted to use started floating around internally. Dominance. Not physical dominance. Narrative dominance. Because she wasn't just part of the broadcast. She was shaping it, guiding where the conversation went, setting the tone, establishing credibility without asking for it. And narrative dominance is dangerous. Because narratives determine who gets opportunities next, who gets invited back, who gets featured, who gets trusted. Once someone starts dominating the narrative, the system reacts fast. Some people lean in. Some people pull back. Some people quietly resent it. Because dominance exposes hierarchy. It shows who actually holds attention and who is simply benefiting from structure. And that's when the embarrassment set in. Not for her. For the people who didn't see this coming. Because insiders later said something brutal. NBC wasn't even the first call. Another network hesitated. Delayed. Overthought it. They evaluated. They waited for confirmation. They wanted to be sure. NBC didn't wait. They booked her. Aired it. And suddenly, they weren't just covering the moment. They owned it. That's the part that stings. Because missing a generational shift isn't just a mistake. It's a stain. It follows careers. It shows up in meetings years later when someone asks, "How did we miss that?" And everyone knew it. That's why, when the show ended, the reaction wasn't loud. It was silent. The kind of silence that follows a realization too big to process immediately. No clapping. No backpatting. No great job tonight. Just people standing around, pretending to check their phones, while thinking the same thing. This didn't feel like a peak. It felt like a warning. Because Caitlin Clark didn't guest star on NBC. She crossed over. She stopped being just a WNBA player and became something broader. A basketball figure. No qualifiers. No lanes. And once someone reaches that level, the system loses its grip. Because players who cross over don't ask where they're allowed to be. They choose. They choose platforms. They choose networks. They choose visibility. That's power. And power is the one thing organizations hate surrendering. Because power creates leverage. Leverage creates negotiation. And negotiation threatens control. So when the lights shut off that night and the building emptied out, one uncomfortable thought lingered in every office involved. If she did this on her first appearance, what happens next time? Because nothing about this felt contained. Nothing about this felt temporary. And the most dangerous part? She made it all look easy. After the broadcast ended, something strange happened. Nothing. No victory tweets. No official statements. No league-wide celebration of a historic crossover moment. Just quiet. And silence is never neutral. In sports, silence usually means two things, confusion or fear. Sometimes both. Because if this night had gone according to plan, there would have been a rollout. Quotes ready. Talking points polished. A clear narrative about growth, collaboration, and progress. None of that came. Instead, people waited. They waited to see what direction the reaction would go. They waited to see if the moment would cool off on its own. They waited because acting too fast would mean admitting something had changed. And something had changed. The uncomfortable truth was becoming harder to avoid. Caitlin Clark didn't debut on NBC. She didn't cameo. She didn't get introduced to a broader audience. She crossed over. And once someone crosses over, you can't put them back in a box. She wasn't just part of women's basketball discourse anymore. She was part of basketball discourse. Period. The kind that transcends leagues, gender, and boundaries that once felt permanent. That's why the reaction felt delayed. Because everyone involved was recalculating. If we acknowledge this fully, what does it mean for the system? If we downplay it, do we look out of touch? If we lean into it, do we lose control? Those questions don't have safe answers. Because the moment you admit a player is bigger than the league's authority weakens. And once authority weakens, everything from negotiations to media strategy shifts. That's why the silence lingered. Because deep down, everyone realized something uncomfortable. Caitlin Clark didn't need this appearance. NBC needed her. And that flips the entire relationship. Players are supposed to chase platforms. Platforms aren't supposed to chase players. At least not publicly. That's how the hierarchy stays intact. But once that illusion breaks, it's visible to everyone. Fans saw it. Networks felt it. The league tried not to say it. And that's why the night felt less like a celebration and more like a line being crossed quietly. Because when someone reaches that level of recognition, they stop asking for permission. They stop waiting for validation. They start choosing where they want to be and how they want to be seen. That kind of freedom scares organizations. Because freedom creates unpredictability. And unpredictability is the enemy of control. The final realization settled slowly but firmly. This wasn't a peak moment. It wasn't a lucky break. It wasn't a one-off. It was the beginning of something the system wasn't ready for. And maybe that's why no one wanted to say it out loud yet. Because once you admit the game has changed, you have to adapt. And adaptation means giving up power. By the next morning, the clips were everywhere. Not just sports feeds. Not just basketball circles. They were bleeding into places they weren't supposed to reach yet. Comment sections filled with the same realization, phrased 100 different ways. She didn't look out of place. She sounded like she belonged there. This feels bigger than the WNBA. That's when the full weight of the night settled in. Because history doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it slips in quietly, disguised as a guest appearance, and only reveals what it was after the fact. Caitlin Clark didn't dominate NBC with flash. She didn't need theatrics. She didn't need controversy. She simply showed up, spoke with authority, and made everyone else adjust around her. And when someone makes history look easy, that's when you know the game has changed. This wasn't about disrespecting the league. It wasn't about skipping lines out of arrogance. It wasn't even about ratings. It was about exposure. Exposure to a truth leagues avoid admitting until they're forced to. That the future doesn't wait for approval. That stars don't always rise inside the structures built for them. Sometimes they rise through them. Once Caitlin Clark crossed that line, from league star to basketball figure, the rules shifted permanently. No labels. No lanes. No ceiling low enough to contain what comes next. And that's why this moment unsettled so many people. Because it wasn't a debut. It was a warning shot. A signal that control doesn't live where it used to. That the old hierarchy only works when everyone agrees to follow it. And that once someone proves they don't need permission, the system has to adapt or be left behind. So the real question isn't what happened that night. It's what happens next. Because if this was her first time stepping onto a stage bigger than her league, what does the second one look like? And who's ready for it? If you want the real stories behind moments like this, the ones leagues won't say out loud and media avoids breaking down, make sure you're subscribed. Because when the game shifts again, this is where you'll hear why it actually happened. And trust me, this story isn't over yet.